Hello, and welcome to the Skype sessions. On the podcast today, you will have heard Matt interviewing Douglas Gresham, who was one of C.S. Lewis's stepsons. And so for today's Skype session, I thought I would just share with you two books which Douglas has written that I think might be worth your attention. Obviously, before we do the video, I need something to drink, so I have a little cup of tea. The mug I actually got from Tea with Tolkien, although it says lattes with Lewis, although I'm drinking tea. So that leaves me all kinds of confused. The first book that I want to talk about is Jack's Life. And this is basically Doug's retelling of the life of C.S. Lewis. And if you've listened to today's podcast already, you'll know that he intended this to be for a younger audience. And while the writing, I think, definitely hits that very well, I think the cover needed to be a little bit more young person friendly. It looks a little serious. But as I say, the writing is really accessible, and I'd feel very confident giving this to a 9-10-year-old maybe. And the tone is very avuncular. You know those sections in the Chronicles of Narnia where Lewis speaks to you, the reader? It's got that sort of a tone. You know, where Lewis says, of course, we all know it's a very silly thing to do to shut oneself up inside a wardrobe. It's that kind of thing. And let me pick out a section to read. By this time, though, Warnie was already beginning to imagine himself to be grown up, and was trying hard to seem even more so. A trap that most young people fall into at some stage, and a silly one too, because the more someone tries to look grown up, the more obvious it is that he or she is still a child. It is not until you stop trying to be grown up that you really seem to be so. Warnie liked to think of himself as a man of the world, and as most of us do at that age, he thought perhaps too much about his appearance and his image. Today we would say that he was trying hard to be cool, never realizing that only those who don't try at all really are cool. Warnie was turning into an image-conscious young twerp, and his influence on Jack was such that Jack started to copy him. So there you go. I think that gives you a good flavour, a good feel for how this book sounds. It's been quite delightful. And this is the other book that I want to talk about, Lenten Lands. It's the first of Doug's books that I read, and it's about his life, and it covers his time in the United States as he was a small boy, and his eventual moving to England, his mother's marriage to Lewis, meeting him for the first time, and then the death of his mother, and then the subsequent death of Lewis. And there's a small portion at the end where we hear what Doug did with the rest of his life, at least up until the point that this was written. And the writing here is a little bit more intense. It's quite moving because it deals with some heavy subjects. A good sample of this is just the opening of chapter 1, where he speaks of Lewis's funeral. The candle flame stood tall and unmoving, creating its own small pool of light in the darkness which seemed to surround me. I saw almost nothing else. The candle, the coffin upon which it stood, and the low overhanging branches of the fir tree which were to shelter the grave. I stood staring down at the coffin until the vicar moved directly in front of me to perform the ritual which would bring to a definite end the second part of my life. Father Head said his words, and the coffin was lowered gently into the earth by men whose faces were revoltingly impassive, smooth, and professionally respectful. How I loathe funerals. On that day in November 1963, there was a bitter stillness about the world. For the second time in my life, everything I knew, everything I held dear, and the one person I loved had been swept away. So you get a flavour. But it's not all intense. And probably the most charming part of this book is the pictures in the middle. Because you get to see a young Doug. Isn't he cute? And there's pictures of Joy in the garden and some of Jack that I hadn't seen before. And I mean, this is when Doug was at school. Look at that smirk. Would you trust that kid? I wouldn't. And it's got some lovely pictures, including one of Mary. You've heard Doug talk about his wife. This is her. And here's a picture of Doug looking very studious. And there are pictures also from their wedding day. And I was quite surprised when I read this to find out that they got married in Westminster Cathedral, which is the Catholic cathedral in London. So if you want to find out how that happened, you need to read the book. But also really nice. So I hope that was useful to you, and please join us again next Tuesday. Cheers.